So we have a student this period. Elisa is coming up to read her poem.
Thank you. Hi, you just heard her. My name is Elisa Drouhard, and I'm going to be performing my own poem. It's called All That I Owe. To say that we owe nothing is cruel. I owe so much. I owe so many. I owe love to the wonder I was born to. I owe my life to this world which has gifted itself to me. I owe my lungs to the air that fills them. I owe my heart to the blood it pumps. I owe my stomach to the to the food that fills it. I owe my eyes to the world they see. I owe it all myself. I owe love to my mother who has loved me. Since she held me, she has loved me. Since I was dependent, she has loved me. Since I have grown, she has loved me. I owe her all my love. I owe love for there is joy. I owe tenderness for there is good. I owe warmth for there is kindness. I owe admiration for there is beauty. I owe love to my father who has loved me. Since he first saw me, he has loved me. Since I first walked, he has loved me. Since I now drive, he has loved me. I owe him all my love. I owe love for there is hate. I owe soft words for there are harsh ones. I know sweetness for there are those who are bitter. I owe clarity for there are liars. I owe love to the pitiful, who have known nothing but strife, who have forgotten their merriment, who have lost their comfort. I owe them my care. I owe pain, for there is war. I owe rage, for there is injustice. I owe fear, for there is terror. I owe grief, for there is tragedy. I owe no love to the harm-bringers, who bring naught but suffering, who steal joy from the joyful, who take more than they are owed. I owe them nothing at all. I owe silence, so I may listen. I owe wonder, so I may learn. I know words, so I may teach. I owe openness, so I may feel. I owe myself love, I who have been here since the beginning, who breathes the air, who gives the love and grief and rage, who owes so much. I owe myself so much. I owe. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. Just a quick reminder, all cell phones should be put away at this time. You don't need them for the presentation today. You also don't need your Chromebook. Thank you. All right, it is with pleasure that I introduce our main presenter or speaker today. We'll be doing an interview format. We have Emily X.R. Pan with us today. She is the New York Times bestselling author of The Astonishing Color of After, which was longlisted for the Carnegie Medal and was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 best YA books of all time. Her latest novel, An Arrow to the Moon, was an instant national bestseller and featured on NPR's Best Books of 2022. She is currently on the faculty of the creative writing programs at the New School and Vermont College of Fine Arts. Please give a warm welcome to Emily X.R. Pan. All right, and for our interview today, if you could also welcome two of my students from my freshman lit class, Isaac and Ronnie. All right, so I was wondering if you could start off telling us a little bit about what The Astonishing Color of After is about. First, can we just see from the crowd, anyone, I know some of my class up front has read part of the book, but has anyone read the book, The Astonishing Color of After? All right, so we got a few people out there, it looks like, yeah. So if you could tell us a little bit what the book is about, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so, oh, this is not on. I thought I turned it on and then, oh, you turned it off. I turned it off. Is it on? Oh, there we go, okay. So, The Astonishing Color of After is about Lee, who believes that when her mother died by suicide, she turned into a bird. So Lee is grieving for her mother. This bird comes to her and basically tells her, you need to go to Taiwan. And Lee ends up going to Taiwan and meeting her grandparents for the first time and digging up all of these family secrets, all of this history that she didn't know. The entire book ends up being this way of processing her grief and trying to understand things that her mother never shared with her.
Awesome, thanks. Kira from our class is wondering, what was your inspiration for the book?
I started writing The Astonishing Color of After in 2010, and back then it was a very different story. I originally began writing it as an ode to my grandmother. So my grandmother was sold as a baby to another family. Her family had too many mouths to feed, and daughters just weren't valued at the time. Thank you, patriarchy. It was considered impractical to have a daughter that you would clothe and feed and raise, and then once she came of age, you would have to pay a dowry to marry her off. The family that purchased my grandmother sold their own daughter in order to have the money to buy my grandmother. And their thinking was that they had a son who, he would grow up and they would want him to be married. And if they purchased a daughter, they could groom her into being the perfect wife for their son. So her adoptive brother was also her betrothed. And she actually, her entire life continued to be friends with Ah Quen, the woman who was sold in order for that family to be able to purchase my grandmother, which is kind of funny. They all lived in this mountain district up in Taiwan called Alipong. So I started, Sorry, I have ADHD brain, so sometimes I forget to finish a story. So my grandmother, when she was about 7 years old, her adoptive father passed away very suddenly from illness, and she dropped out of school and became the family's sole source of income. So every day she would wake up at the crack of dawn, she'd climb up the mountain, pick all the tea leaves she could, they would be weighed, she would be paid by the weight, and she'd bring that income back to her family, and that was how they survived. When she finally came of age, her adoptive mother was like, you've been an amazing daughter. You've been an amazing member of this family. Like, what would we have done without you? I know that my son is awful. You don't have to marry him. So she was off the hook for that. And not long after that, a guy came up the mountain knocking on every single door saying, all these years ago, my family sold my baby sister and I'm trying to find her. And that was my grandmother's brother. So he brought her back down to Taipei, where at that point my family had done a 180 with their financials. They had claimed a plot of land, built a hotel, the hotel business was thriving, and my grandmother went to work in that hotel. And the stories just get wilder and wilder from there. So I had started out wanting to tell this story of my grandmother in novel form. So it was historical fiction. It started in 1927 in Taiwan, and I very quickly got super overwhelmed trying to do the historical research, especially as the mountain district I mentioned, Alipong, there was no information about it. It was such an insignificant little area that there's no photo documentation, there's no records of it. People only know what it's called if you live there. You can't even go on the internet right now and look it up. You can't find anything. And maybe you could say that that's license for me to make stuff up, but that was just one tiny slice of the pie of everything I would have to research for the history. So because I got overwhelmed, I reworked the book. I set it so that it was in modern times and it was a teenager today who was getting her grandmother's story for the first time. So that was how I worked on the book for a number of years on and off. I was just writing it that way. And then in 2014, I lost my aunt to suicide. And it was obviously an earth-shattering event for my family. It was extremely difficult. And we had all these conversations about how our grief needed to happen. My family is Buddhist, and they were saying, you can't weep audibly for your aunt, because if her spirit can hear you weeping, her spirit will be distracted, will be tethered to the material world, and we need her to, go and journey off and take the best route possible. So they were trying to kind of micromanage how everybody in the family was grieving, was processing all of this, and I got really angry about that. So I withdrew into myself and I started rewriting The Astonishing Color of After from scratch again, because I'd already rewritten it many different ways. I started rewriting it from scratch again, and this time it became about a girl who was processing the death of her mother by suicide. And that was also the point at which it became really magical, and I brought in this red bird. So yeah, that was kind of the origin of the book, and then the more that I delved into it, the more it became me wrestling with my own grief and my own experiences of growing up in a household with a lot of depression, and how to have those conversations and how insidious the stigma can be.
So the section we read in class is when Lee first is staying with her grandparents, and her dad leaves her all alone, and so she feels a bit, out of place. But something that Mira wants to know from our class is Lee stays hopeful, and so she wants to know, how did you decide that Lee was to be as hopeful as she is at that point?
I don't know that I made that conscious of a decision. I don't know that when I was writing it, I sat down and thought, Lee needs to be hopeful. I think I just wrote from the perspective of, if I were in Lee's shoes, I would want answers. And the only way to get answers is to continue in pursuit of them, just be relentless. And so I think that what you're perceiving as hopefulness is maybe just my way of being you just can't give up, you just have to persevere, you just have to press forward.
For my class, Sarah wants to know about your descriptions. She said your descriptions of things are really beautiful, so I'm curious what you think about when writing them. Is there a certain image in mind, or is it just thought while writing?
A lot of the time when I'm writing, it's very image-based. Or if I get stuck, if I'm having a day where I'm struggling to break into the writing, I will actually give myself the challenge of, okay, well, just write one image, just describe that one image. And that's oftentimes how it begins for me. And so I might write a description, and then my description feels kind of mediocre. And then I ask myself, well, what makes this interesting? What is it about this image that calls to me? And how can I make it feel fresh? So, what people call beautiful descriptions, for me is just me using words in a way that feels surprising to me. So associating colors with smell, or associating colors with feelings, or using words that might feel unusual in a certain context. That makes it interesting to me. And it's that interest that then makes me excited to write the next sentence. So that's kind of the way the process works.
Yeah. Well, in Taiwan with her grandparents, Lee describes some of the food she has. Have you tried the food you included in your book, and why did you decide to include the meals in the story?
I tried everything. Everything that's in the book, I have eaten or I ate on my research trip to Taiwan. So I sold the book in 2016. Early 2016 was when I signed with my agent at the end of 2015. We sold the book early 2016 to my publisher. The book came out in 2018, to give you an idea of publishing timelines. I booked a trip to Taiwan in 2016 to do research in order to be able to write the book, to flesh out all the parts of Taiwan. And I ate a lot of food while I was there. So I was taking meticulous notes. A lot of what I ate, my characters ended up eating, but also a lot of the food in there, I think of food as being really important context. Food is how we relate to each other. I think about how my mother, her idea of an easy default dinner that she's going to put on the table is going to be very different than what your family would put on the table. And it speaks a lot to how we relate to each other, and how we are kind of brought up in our families. What does food mean to us? What does a snack mean to us? what would we eat when we're sick? What do we identify as comfort food? All of these things kind of become ways of adding color to our characters. So I definitely think food is really important to me in my writing because it serves as this shorthand of like, this is how this family exists. This is how they relate to each other. This is their context.
So Nara also has a question about your writing style. Why did you choose to add in all the pinyin of the Chinese words?
Oh, the pinyin. Yeah, no worries. Pinyin, which is the romanization of Chinese. You know, I wanted to capture the feeling, and I wanted to show Lee's grasp of the language and her learning the language, and I also wanted to just like really ground it in the experience of the characters. In writing, in publishing these days, there's actually a little bit of a debate over like whether to italicize words in languages that are not English. And I made a very intentional choice in The Astonishing Color of After, which if anybody ever reads An Arrow to the Moon, you'll notice is completely different. So in The Astonishing Color of After, it's italicized because for Lee, it's not a language that she lives and breathes. Like, she feels a little bit separate from it. She's not able to understand everything that her grandmother says. And so including the pinyin is a way of capturing that. She's able to understand some of it. She's able to try to communicate a little bit. Versus in An Arrow to the Moon, the characters who are speaking Mandarin, that's like their default setting. That's, you know, they live and breathe that. And so I don't italicize it because it's just what they're used to. So it's definitely like whenever I put pinyin into my novels, there's a very intentional choice there. Like what context, what commentary am I making in terms of the language and how these people interact with each other?
So Nathan is wondering, how long did it take to write The Astonishing Color of After and go through the whole editing, publishing, and promotion process?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I started writing it in 2010. I would say I kind of drafted it, drafted nonstop from 2010 through 2011. I took a little bit of a break and worked on something else. I came back to it. I think I worked on it a little bit more in 2012. I was really going back and forth. Like I was working on The Astonishing Color of After. I would do a couple drafts. I would get fed up. Then I would turn to a different novel and do multiple drafts of that and come back to it. So it's hard to pin down the exact time. But in 2015, I prioritized writing The Astonishing Color of After. That was like all I was giving my attention to. I rewrote it from scratch. I had lost track of how many times I'd rewritten it at that point. But that was the version that got me my agent. In 2016, after I sold the book, I spent all of 2016 and 2017 revising it, getting it ready for publication, and then it came out in 2018. So usually a book is done, you know, sometimes publishers will scrunch the schedules, but most frequently a book is going to be done and delivered about a year before it actually comes out. So that process is, you know, it's pretty intense. And it varies for everybody because you have to spend time querying agents, trying to get an agent, and then once you get an agent, they have to spend time trying to get editors interested in the project, and then once the editor has interest, they have to spend time getting the publisher, like the overall house, interested in the project, and then they have to figure out the timeline for when they want to publish it. And every editor also has kind of a different working style. So some editors take a lot longer to edit a book. Some editors are much lighter with their hands. But so Astonishing, you know, I started it in 2010, it was published in 2018. An Arrow to the Moon, I had the idea for it in 2016. I first started playing with it in 2017. I didn't start like really fully working on it until 2018 after I was done doing like the whole book tour thing for The Astonishing Color of After. And then that ended up coming out in 2022.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what the book tour is like? Just like, what is that like going around promoting this book that you have spent so much time on and put so much of yourself in? What was that like for you going around doing the tour?
Yeah, it's really fun. It's really amazing to get to meet readers and travel all over the country. You know, I would have different bookstores where I would go and do an event, and oftentimes people would travel from really far away to come to my events, which that was really cool. People will bring me artwork, which I find really incredible, like artwork inspired by my books. People will also share like really personal stories with me. So it's a really magical experience getting to connect with readers who just, you know, really, the book like really resonates for them.
So we have some questions that are more general about like your writing experience, but before we do that, would you be willing to read a little bit of your new book to us, An Arrow to the Moon?
Yeah, absolutely. I will read it on my phone. I'm not live tweeting, I swear. And I'll start from the beginning. So An Arrow to the Moon, for context, is Romeo and Juliet meets Chinese mythology. And it's primarily set in the 90s. I'll start from the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived on the moon as its guardian. She was its heart and its breath. One day, standing on tiptoe to glimpse the boy who made the stars fly, she lost her footing and stumbled off the edge. Her plummet was like a stone displacing water. It shifted the universe off its axis. Slowly, slowly, everything began to crack. 1974, Xi'an Village. The air smelled of overturned earth and impossible things. Birds dove in front of the sun like embering ash from a stick of incense. The farmer wiped the sweat from his brow and paused his work at the drill to take a swig of water. He spat aside the grass in his mouth and felt a shiver cross his skin, that distinct feeling of being watched. The unblinking eyes stared at him from several paces away, low in the grass, the head of a man, mud-colored, preserved. Was it some kind of hungry ghost making itself visible in order to bestow a request upon the living? No, neither a man nor a ghost. A sculpture? The farmer thought it was likely made of the same clay as the teapot that sat on his kitchen table. A nudge of his foot sent it rolling and revealed a shard of similar material half buried in the ground. "What are you doing?" another man called as he bent toward the land. "The well won't be over there." "I found something," he replied. "Do you have a shovel?" "What do you want a shovel for?" The others came over to watch as the farmer dug and scraped. More hands and tools joined to scratch at the earth, and by the time the sun was treading below the horizon, they'd pulled up a collection of broken terracotta pieces, enough to fill a wheelbarrow. The men would take these to the nearest city to see what money could be gotten for them. Someone called out, "Look!" They all saw it, light shining from the very bottom of what they'd excavated. It burned brighter with each second, and the men held up palms to shield their eyes. The ground shook. One farmer shouted an earthquake warning. By now, the world was a quick dimming gray. It was in this almost night that they watched the silvery light rise into the sky, a star falling in reverse, until it disappeared from sight, and none of the farmers could be sure the phenomenon had been real. The star arched through the skies. It cracked in half as it fell back down to the other side of the globe. One piece landed first. The other tumbled for a longer stretch. In those moments, 2 children were born and given their names: Hunter Yi, Luna Chang. 1991, in Fairbridge, where we lay our scene. Luna Chang was about to make a bad decision. The door of the walkout basement yawned wide, and the older kids were already pouring into the night. Guppies who'd been flushed down the toilet, now finding their freedom. "What are you doing?" Luna said to no one specific. "There's a guy the next house over who's a senior at Fairbridge High. He's throwing a party," said one girl. "Like a real party?" said Luna. "Yeah." The girl hesitated. "Our shoes are upstairs, though." As if in response, a saxophone intro blared from above, followed by some auntie's microphone-enhanced vibrato. Luna hated these things. Her mother and father liked getting together with the other Mandarin-speaking members of their very white community, which, good for them. What she didn't get was why they had to drag her along. While the parents wailed out Chinese oldies on the sound system upstairs, all the kids aged 4 through 18 were relegated to the basement. This was where the youngest ones wreaked havoc and broke the cue sticks of the miniature billiard set, where the teenagers were sullen-faced and sighing, and the oldest ones pretended not to have heard about one another's SAT scores from their parents. Luna used to have Roxy for company, but Roxy was away at college now. "We're celebrating the Mid-Autumn Festival," her father had said when Luna didn't want to go. He'd opened his face wide with exaggerated cheer. "There will be so many different types of mooncakes." And then he was wrong. There was only one kind, red bean, and they didn't even have salted egg yolks in them. This party sucked. Luna could stay here in this corner of this random auntie's house, watching awkward middle schoolers work at loops of string for Cat's Cradle, listening to the occasional exchange of jokes that weren't particularly funny, idly wondering about the people she didn't recognize and probably would never see again. Or she could do something different. Her heart drummed in her ears. Luna was not a rule breaker. We'll stop there.
So Andrew from our class was wondering, what age did you really start to get into writing?
I started trying to, so I was raised on stories basically from the time I could speak. My mom wrote creative nonfiction in Chinese, and my mom's pretty widely published in Chinese. And my dad, I wouldn't get bedtime stories read to me. My dad would make up stories on the spot every night, which I didn't appreciate just how difficult and how impressive that was until I was much older. And when I started to have opinions and be kind of bossy, he was like, well, let's make up the stories together. So from a very young age, we were constantly just inventing stories. And I started trying to write stories down before I could even spell. Like, I would make up my own spelling. I would just try to pretend like I understood how the alphabet worked. I remember distinctly that I wrote my first short story, a very silly short story that my dad actually sent me a copy of pretty recently, in the second grade. And I actually wrote an entire story from beginning to end. So I was very interested in storytelling from very early on, and just, it kind of became a practice that was just built into my life.
Mubina from our class wants to know why you chose to be an author.
I guess it was just, it was the thing that I couldn't not do, I've had so many interests in my life. I was a really intense musician in high school. I also do a lot of visual art, but writing was just, it's kind of like what I constantly want to be doing. I constantly want to be making up stories and pinning them down. I love the idea of sharing them with people. I love the idea that storytelling is kind of the most human thing that we do. Like, you see your friends after a long weekend, and you're like, oh, you'll never guess what happened Saturday night, right? Like, you start with a story. You connect with people by telling stories. And I just think that's so incredibly pure and important, and it's just my favorite thing to do.
So you already kind of mentioned this with The Astonishing Color of After, but Jordan wants to know, how did you find inspiration to write? Is it from your life experiences or just a story you come up with?
I definitely draw from life experiences, and there's a little bit of me in every character, antagonists, protagonists. There's some bit of me somewhere in there, but I very often will start with a concept that is just intriguing to me, or a question, or something that I want to capture. Like, as I mentioned with Astonishing, I started by wanting to tell the story of my grandmother and figure out how to kind of put that together into a novel. With An Era to the Moon, I'd always known that I wanted to do my own version of Romeo and Juliet, because I remember reading Romeo and Juliet. I'm pretty sure it was the first Shakespeare play that I actually read on paper. And I remember going into it thinking, oh gosh, Shakespeare's probably going to be really hard to read. And then I thought it was really delightful. I thought Romeo and Juliet was hilarious. Shakespeare's play on words was just really fun for me, and I loved the story, but I was really annoyed by the characters, because Romeo is like the whiniest person in the world, and Juliet just has no agency, and they just fall into lust and then make all these terrible decisions. So I wanted to write my own version of that for, as long as I could remember. And then I also knew that I wanted to do a retelling of the mythology of Hou-Yi and Chang'e, the divine archer and the goddess of the moon. And that was my favorite mythology when I was growing up. And also, I read a lot of world mythology as I was growing up, and I was constantly frustrated that if you got like a compendium, like an anthology of world mythology, oh gosh, that was a mouthful, anthology of world mythology. There might be like pages and pages about Persephone. You know, you'd find so much about Artemis and Aphrodite, and if there existed anything about Hoi or Chang'e, it'd be like a sentence or a paragraph in this entire anthology. And I felt like they weren't getting their due, so I wanted to do that retelling also. And then I had this light bulb moment one day where I was like, wait, Romeo and Juliet, that's a star-crossed lovers story that ends in tragedy. And Hoi and Chang'e is also a star-crossed lover story that ends in tragedy. What if I combine these together? So the way that, you know, ideas come to me, it really varies. Sometimes it's just, there's a spark of me being like, oh, that could be cool. And then I go down this rabbit hole of seeing what it feels like to pursue that. And sometimes it's just a concept. Like, what is it like to have somebody die and turn into a bird when you're grieving them?
All right, can a teacher out there tell us what time it is? Because I'm trying to figure out how much time we have left.
12 more minutes.
Okay, so we'd like to find out if there's anyone in the audience right now who has questions, because we have a few more questions, but we're happy to take questions. Is that Miss Shanebeck I see there? Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for being here. I really enjoyed this. I was just wondering, I was reading a little bit about your book before this presentation, and one of the authors said that your book is one of the most important books for young adult people to read, especially in terms of the scope of mental health. And I was wondering if that's something that, you know, you spoke a little bit about your aunt, and thanks for sharing that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that, or your lens on that as an author, you know, writing a story, if that was something you sought out to do, or what you thought about that.
Oh, well, I mean, that's really amazing to hear. I definitely struggled a lot with writing the book because for so long I shied away from directly talking about mental illness and suicide. And at some point I realized, I think it was maybe a few drafts in, I realized that I had to tackle them head on and that I had to figure out how to talk about it explicitly and sensitively, you know? And so I really appreciate hearing when people think that it's like really valuable in that regard, because I put so much work into being careful, you know, careful and authentic and compassionate. It was something that like really irks me is when suicide exists in the story as like a thrilling plot point or like as a catalyst for some exciting thing to happen, and it's not unpacked and it's not like the weight of it just is kind of missing. And so I really didn't want to do that. That was my greatest fear with this book, was that it would seem like, you know, I was like somehow Hollywoodizing something, and I wanted to be very careful that the book was, you know, trying to help eliminate stigma, trying to help open up conversations about mental health. I always share very openly about my aunt because I think it's important to kind of lead by example, that like we should talk about these things so that it doesn't become something that's like hushed up. We shouldn't be scared of mental illness. It's just like any other illness. You know, we take Zoloft for anxiety and depression the way that we take insulin for diabetes. There are so many reasons why I think it's important to have those conversations. And it's been also kind of, you know, this blessing that when news of my book came out, like when it was announced, I had so many friends reach out to me to be like, oh, I've never told you this, and I've never told anyone in our circle of friends this, but like I lost my brother to suicide like a decade ago. And it was just, it kind of was shocking to me how so many people in my immediate network had been touched by suicide, and I'd never known, because we feel like it's something that we can't talk about. And then there's this shame about it, and then there's this kind of inability to prevent more suicides because we're not talking about it. So yeah, that turned into kind of a ramble, but yeah, it really means a lot when people connect with the book and find it important in that way.
Okay, I think I see another hand right there. Yeah.
What's your favorite part about writing process?
My favorite part of the writing process? I think I enjoy when I reach the end. I think I enjoy when I feel like I've accomplished what I set out to do. Like with An Arrow to the Moon, I don't know how many artists we might have in the audience, but if you've ever tried to make something, or even imagine you're trying to bake a cake into a certain shape or something, anything that you try to make, you always have this vision in your mind of this is what I'm gonna create. And the end result rarely matches up with what you're creating, especially if you're making something from scratch. An Arrow to the Moon was the first time in my life that I set out to make something and actually arrived at my goal. My end result actually matched my vision. And for that reason, I'm fiercely proud of it. And I think no feeling, no other external validation or anything matches that feeling of knowing that I accomplished what I set out to do.
Other questions?
Yeah, Miss Maestri.
Hi there. Is your writing process very different when you write your fiction novels as compared to when you write poetry? Because I think you write poetry as well, is that right?
I do. I write poetry primarily for myself. I rarely share any of my poetry, and it is very different. I try to keep poetry as a fun and experimental space for myself. I also think that as a creative, it's really important to have private spaces. It's really important to have things that I do that are not meant for sharing, that are it's kind of like my personal sandbox. And so poetry is that for me, and I might just start with a question to myself that I start answering with wordplay, or I might start with trying to capture an image. And the way that I think about words is very different with poetry, because poetry is kind of about the sparseness. Poetry is about what can you do with these few words that you're saying? The words that you choose have to be so intentional. You kind of have to approach writing like you're holding a scalpel the whole time. Whereas with a novel, I actually let myself be as verbose as I need to be, and I cut it back in revision. I think I cut 100 pages from The Astonishing Color of After in my last draft before sending the final manuscript off. I cut about 100 pages from it. And I still, now in hindsight, I think it's too long still. But the way that I think about them is completely different. And the way that I think about nonfiction is also different. There are similarities too, right? I think everything needs to have a narrative arc. So when I sit down to write a poem, even though I might be focused on playing with the words, even though I might be focused on an image, I'm asking myself, what's the arc of this poem? So that's, I guess, the primary similarity across the different forms that I write in. But I try to let myself approach them differently and with a sense of play. Yes?
What keeps you motivated to keep writing?
What keeps me motivated to keep writing? I think I have to be interested in the concept and the characters, and then I just have to commit to finishing it, to seeing it through to the end. So, a lot of it is kind of just sheer force of will. Sometimes it can get really exhausting. And also, once you're a published author, you have all this pressure from the publishing industry. I have pressure from my editor and the people who are promoting my book. I have pressure from readers who are like, when's your next book gonna come out? And I have to figure out how to dial all that volume down, because it's actually very unproductive. That pressure prevents me from being able to really focus on my creative vision. So at the end of the day, I think what drives me is really sticking to this idea of I have something I want to make and I want to accomplish that, and I'm not going to let anybody else tell me what that's going to be.
Yeah, over here.
Do you have any distinct plans for future projects?
I'm working on 4 different books right now. So I will say yes, but also ADHD brain, so we'll see how long it takes when I'm juggling 4 different projects at the same time. But I'm under contract for another young adult novel, so that's probably the first thing I'm going to be finishing.
When you began writing the book, were you prepared to talk about mental health, especially with a personal experience?
I'll be honest, when I was writing it, I was terrified to talk about it. And, you know, my family is very much guilty of being caught up in the stigma, being like, no, don't share things like that. But it's always been really important to me, this idea that, like, you know, I think I was saying earlier, like, stories connect us. And the whole point is to share this very human experience so that we can have these conversations. So when I started going out and promoting the book, I was nervous about it at first, but I found out the more that I shared, the more that people would come up to me afterwards and be like, I really want to thank you for this book because it was important to me because of like my personal experience. And I started to get all these personal connections that just really amazed me and felt so important. And it became this thing that felt crucial. It felt like something I couldn't not talk about. But there was definitely, like, even when I was writing it, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to promote this book.
Anyone else? Oh, I think I see a hand there. Yes.
What draws you to the YA genre? Is it always something that you wanted to do?
I have always tried to divorce the way I think about writing from the way the industry labels writing. But what I love about this question is that, you know, my novels could also be published as adult novels. I chose very intentionally to pursue the YA market because I think young adult readers are some of the most open-minded readers out there. And what I mean by that is, like, if you go on social media and, like, let's say you look at like Instagram or TikTok and somebody's showing a compilation of everything they read in a month, the people who are YA readers, they read so widely. They'll have like a romance novel, a hard sci-fi novel, like a horror, thriller, and maybe something like realistic, all thrown in there. They're like reading this varied diet versus we all probably know people who they go to the bookstore and they make a beeline for the romance section or they make a beeline for the sci-fi section and they never leave those aisles, right? So I loved the idea of an audience that was so receptive and so open-minded because my books are weird. You know, like when I was trying to publish The Astonishing Color of After, I was like, I don't know how bookstores are going to categorize this book. I don't know how readers are going to respond to it. I'm just writing what's interesting to me, and what I like is weird stuff. And so I think I wanted that open-mindedness, and I also just like the idea of appealing to an audience that is like, they just want a good story. They'll read anything as long as it's a good story.
Ms. Shanebeck, can I get a time check again?
Yep. We're about like 15 seconds out.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Can we give Emily a round of applause? And
Thank you so much for your questions.